My wife's family asked me to be a sperm donor for her sister. My decision. Life has a way of throwing the strangest curveballs at you when you least expect it. If you told me 5 years ago that I'd be sitting here, trying to make sense of what happened, I wouldn't have believed you. I thought my life was as straightforward as it could get. A steady job, a loving wife, 2 wonderful kids, and a routine that made me feel grounded. But sometimes the people closest to you, family, can surprise you in ways you never saw coming. I married Ashley when I was 29. She was everything I wanted in a partner. Smart, kind, and with a sense of humor that could light up the darkest days. We built a life together in a small town in Illinois, not far from Chicago. It wasn't a flashy life, but it was ours. We had a modest house with a porch swing she adored and a backyard where our kids would eventually learn to ride their bikes. It felt like the American dream in many ways. Ashley had a sister, Samantha. They were close, the kind of siblings who called each other daily and finished each other's sentences. Samantha was married to Mark, and though I wouldn't say we were best friends, we got along well enough. Family barbecues, holidays, the usual gatherings, Mark and I always found common ground, whether it was talking about the Bears game or swapping dad jokes. But there was one big difference between us. While Ashley and I had 2 kids, Samantha and Mark didn't have any. It wasn't for lack of trying. They'd been married a few years longer than us and had wanted kids from the start. Samantha had always dreamed of being a mom. Ashley would tell me how, growing up, Samantha used to collect baby dolls and play house for hours. But as the years went on, and no babies came, the tension in their marriage grew. You could see it at family events. Samantha would get quiet whenever someone asked when they were planning to have kids, and Mark would just stare at his plate, avoiding eye contact. Eventually, Samantha started opening up to Ashley about their struggles. They'd gone through all the usual tests. Samantha was perfectly healthy, but Mark wasn't. Apparently, his sperm count was low, and the ones that were there weren't exactly Olympic swimmers. It's one of those topics no one wants to talk about, but when it's your family, you hear things whether you want to or not. I tried to be supportive in the ways I could. I'd offer to watch their dog when they went to appointments or just lend an ear when Ashley needed to vent about how frustrated her sister was. But I kept my distance emotionally. It wasn't my problem to solve, right? I had my own family to think about, my own responsibilities. Still, I felt for them. It's tough to watch someone you care about struggle with something they want so badly. Things came to a head about a year ago. Samantha and Mark had tried just about everything, IVF, specialized diets, even acupuncture. Nothing worked. Mark had even undergone some kind of surgery that was supposed to help, but it didn't. You could see the toll it was taking on them. Samantha looked exhausted all the time, and Mark was quieter than usual. It was like this unspoken cloud hung over them every time they walked into a room. Then, one Sunday afternoon, Ashley told me that her parents wanted to have a family meeting. Nothing unusual about that. Her mom was always organizing these get-togethers. It's good for the family to stay close, she'd say. So I didn't think much of it. We packed up the kids, drove over to Ashley's parents' house, and settled in for what I assumed would be the usual. A meal, some laughter, and the latest updates on everyone's lives. But this meeting wasn't like the others. For starters, it was just the adults. Ashley and me, Samantha and Mark, and her parents. The kids were sent outside to play. That should have been my first clue that something was off, but I figured maybe they wanted to discuss finances or something private. What else could it be? We all sat in the living room, the kind of space that feels more formal than comfortable. You know the type, plastic covers on the furniture, perfectly aligned family photos on the walls. Ashley's mom cleared her throat and started talking about family values, about how important it was to stick together during tough times. I nodded along, thinking, sure, that makes sense. Family's everything, right? Then she dropped the bombshell. Apparently, during one of their late-night conversations, Samantha had come up with a solution to their problem. Since the issue wasn't with her but with Mark, she thought, why not ask someone else to help? And by someone else, she meant me. At first, I thought I must have misheard her. I actually glanced over at Ashley, waiting for her to laugh and tell me it was some kind of weird joke. But no one was laughing. Everyone was just staring at me, waiting for my reaction. I can't even describe the cocktail of emotions that hit me in that moment. Shock, disbelief, maybe even a little anger. How do you even process something like that? They were asking me, Ashley's husband, Samantha's brother-in-law, to father her child. And the way they talked about it, you'd think they were asking me to help move a couch or something. Just a simple favor. I remember sitting there, frozen, as they laid out their reasoning. It wasn't like they were asking me to cheat on Ashley, they said. It would all be clinical, no emotions, just a medical procedure. And wasn't it better to keep it in the family? They acted like this was the most logical, reasonable thing in the world, and I was the crazy one for not immediately agreeing. But it wasn't logical. It wasn't reasonable. It wasn't normal. I mean, how do you even begin to untangle something like that? There were so many layers to it. Moral, emotional, even spiritual. I was raised Catholic, and this went against everything I'd been taught about marriage, family, and commitment. And even if I could set aside my own beliefs, what about Ashley? What about our kids? How was I supposed to explain this to them someday? I sat there in silence as they continued to explain their plan. I could feel the pressure mounting, the unspoken expectation that I would say yes because it's for the family. But all I could think was, how did it come to this? How did a simple family meeting turn into this bizarre, surreal moment? The family meeting ended without any agreements, but it didn't feel like the end of the conversation. More like the calm before the storm. Driving home that night, I couldn't even bring myself to look at Ashley. The air in the car was thick with tension, though the kids in the back seat were oblivious, chatting about the games they'd played with their cousins. Ashley didn't say much either, just stared out the window, her arms crossed, her jaw set. I could feel something brewing, but I wasn't ready to face it yet. I needed time to process, to wrap my head around what had just been thrown at me. By the time we got home and put the kids to bed, I was exhausted, not physically but emotionally. I thought maybe Ashley and I could just go to bed and talk about it the next day, but she had other plans. As soon as the bedroom door closed, she turned to me and said, "We need to talk." I sighed. "Ashley, I can't do this right now. I need time." But Ashley wasn't having it. She launched right into it, talking about family, about sacrifices, about doing good deeds for others. She said things like, "It's just one small thing, and this could change Samantha's life." Her voice was calm, almost too calm, but her words hit me like a battering ram. She had clearly thought this through, or at least convinced herself that she had. What I couldn't understand was how she had agreed to this so quickly, so boldly. It wasn't just that it was wrong. It felt unnatural. I told her as much, trying to explain my side, but she didn't want to hear it. Every time I brought up adoption, she brushed it off, saying it wasn't the same. She said Samantha wanted to experience pregnancy, to feel the baby kick, to go through the whole journey herself. "You can't replace that with adoption," she said. "It's not the same bond." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to yell, to tell her how absurd this all was. But I didn't. I just sat there, staring at the floor, feeling more alone than I ever had in my marriage. Over the next few days, the pressure only grew. Ashley kept bringing it up at every opportunity. When we were making dinner, when we were folding laundry, even in the middle of watching TV. It was like she couldn't let it go, and the more she talked about it, the more isolated I felt. She'd say things like, "If you really cared about family, you'd do this, or this is what good people do. They help those they love." It was exhausting, and no matter how much I tried to explain my feelings, it was like she couldn't, or wouldn't, understand. And then there was Mark. I wasn't surprised when he called me a few days later, asking if we could meet up. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity, but also because I thought maybe he'd see things from my perspective. Maybe he'd understand why this felt so wrong to me. We met at a small diner just outside of town, the kind of place where the coffee's always hot and the waitresses know your name. Mark was already there when I arrived, sitting in a booth in the back. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. When I sat down, he gave me a small, weary smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Mark didn't waste any time. He got straight to the point, saying he understood why I was hesitant, why this felt wrong. He admitted that he felt the same way at first, that the idea had made his stomach churn. But then he started talking about Samantha, about how much this meant to her, how much she wanted to have a child of her own. He said adoption wasn't an option for her. Not because she didn't think it was valid, but because she wanted the experience of carrying her own baby. "It's important to her," he said. "More important than I ever realized." He was trying to be reasonable, to appeal to my sense of empathy, but all I felt was frustration. Why was this my problem to solve? Why was everyone acting like I was the key to their happiness? I told him as much, trying to keep my voice steady, but he just nodded, like he'd been expecting it. "I get it," he said, "but think about it. Really think about it." The conversation left me feeling more conflicted than ever. On the one hand, I could see how much Samantha and Mark were struggling, how desperate they were. But on the other hand, this wasn't just some simple favor. It was my life, my marriage, my beliefs that were being thrown into the mix, and I wasn't sure I could handle it. And then there were Ashley's parents. They called me the next day, asking if I could come over to talk. I didn't want to go, but Ashley insisted, saying it was important. So, I went, hoping maybe they'd be the voice of reason in all this. They weren't. Instead, they spent the entire conversation trying to convince me that this was the right thing to do. They talked about family obligations, about the importance of helping each other, about how much this meant to Samantha. They said things like, "You're the only one who can help, and this is what family is all about." By the time I left, I felt like I was being pulled in 1,000 different directions, and no one was listening to what I wanted. The pressure was relentless. Everywhere I turned, someone was there, reminding me of my duty, my responsibility. Even Samantha started dropping hints, thanking me in advance for considering it and talking about how much this would mean to her. It was like they'd all decided this was going to happen, and I was the only one who hadn't gotten the memo. At home, things were no better. Ashley's gentle persuasion had turned into outright frustration. She accused me of being selfish, of putting my own feelings above the needs of the family. She said things like, "I thought you were better than this, and you're letting everyone down." It hurt more than I cared to admit. I started to feel like I was losing myself, like I was drowning in a sea of expectations and guilt. No matter how much I tried to explain my feelings, no one seemed to care. They just wanted me to say yes, to do what they thought was right, regardless of how it made me feel. I didn't know how much more of it I could take. It all came to a boiling point when I decided I couldn't keep silent anymore. The weight of their expectations had become unbearable, and I knew the only way to set things straight was to gather everyone. Ashley, her parents, Samantha, and Mark, and tell them all at the same time how I felt. We met at Ashley's parents' house one evening. The room was tense as we sat around the dining table. Samantha looked hopeful, Mark seemed resigned, and Ashley wore the same determined expression she had been using for weeks. Her parents were quiet, though their eyes hinted at the disappointment they already seemed to feel. I knew they thought they had me cornered, that I would finally cave under their collective pressure. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I've thought long and hard about what you're asking of me," I began. "And I need to make something very clear. I will not do it." The silence that followed was deafening. They all stared at me, as if I'd just uttered something unthinkable. But I didn't let their reactions deter me. I had spent too long being pulled in every direction, and this was my moment to stand firm. "This is not the right step," I continued, my voice calm but resolute. "It's not right for me, and frankly, it's not right for any of us. What you're asking goes against everything I believe in, not just as a man, but as a person of faith. A child should be born within a marriage, not outside of it. That's what I believe, and I won't compromise my values for anyone, not even for family." Ashley opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Please let me finish," I said. "You've all had your say. Now it's my turn." I looked at each of them in turn, making sure my words were heard. "You're all trying to manipulate me, to guilt me into doing something I don't believe is right. You've made me out to be the bad guy because I won't meet your expectations. But let me tell you something, those expectations are wrong. And it's not fair to put this on me simply because you've decided it's the only solution." I could see the anger rising in some of their faces, but I pressed on. "According to our faith, our shared faith, this is not acceptable. You know that as well as I do. A child is a blessing, yes, but a child should come into this world through love and commitment between two people in marriage. What you're asking me to do goes against those principles. And if you think that's okay, then maybe you need to take a hard look at what you believe." I paused, letting my words sink in before continuing. "If you truly want to be parents, there is another way. You can adopt. There are so many children out there who need loving homes, who need the kind of care and kindness you have to offer. Adoption isn't giving up. It's an act of love, of selflessness. And it doesn't break any moral or spiritual laws. If you want to do good, that's how you do it." When I finished, the room was silent again, but this time it felt heavier, more final. I could see the frustration in Ashley's eyes, the disappointment in her parents, and the mix of emotions in Samantha and Mark. But I didn't waver. I had said my piece, and there was nothing more to discuss. That evening, I left their house feeling lighter than I had in weeks. For the first time, I wasn't burdened by guilt or shame. I had stood up for what I believed in, and no amount of pressure or manipulation could take that away from me.